And as we been going through this, we noted that verses 1 through 5 deals with the Emmanuel's divine government, that it was Davidic in nature or in origin. It had divine approval, the Spirit being upon him, and that's in verse 2, the Spirit of wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, fear of the Lord. And then we also see in verses 3 through 5 the aspect of the fact that it would be a righteous reign, that righteousness and faithfulness would be the main aspects of it. That brings us down to verse 6, where we're going to begin this evening. And in verses 6 through verse 9, I titled it as Emmanuel's Peaceful Kingdom. And he says in verse 6 that the wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. Isaiah is thus showing the peaceful nature of this messianic kingdom. And to illustrate it, along with the next few verses actually, he's going to use animals that would naturally be enemies as being coupled together. That one of them, the natural prey of the other, yet they're living in harmony together. And so he's showing, because these two natural enemies are now lying down together, they are together, living together in harmony, he shows the peaceful nature of that kingdom. When you look at the wolf and the lamb, well, what would happen from a natural standpoint if you put those two together? Lamb's not going to last too long, is he? Because the wolf's going to eat him. That's the nature of the two animals. The leopard and the kid. The kid here would be a young goat. Okay, Dale.
It's hard not to think of a comparison of at one point before conversion, Saul being the wolf and the lambs being Christians. You want to project it on into the future, and then Saul turning from wolf to lamb.
I think that's a little bit stretch of what is being discussed here, though. I think it's a stretch from the application of what we see here. Yes. He's not dealing with those who are not Christians as opposed to those who are. He's showing the peaceful nature of the kingdom itself. And that thus within the kingdom, within the church, there is a peaceful aspect. Not in relationship to those who are not Christians. That's not under consideration in what Isaiah is writing here. The only ones who are under consideration is the kingdom, and in the kingdom or in the church. But the leopard lying down with the kid or the young goat, again, normally under the physical world, the leopard's going to eat the goat or the young kid. The calf and the young lion, and fatted calf, again, together. He's showing A lion would normally eat the others, but in this case, now then in the kingdom, they were together. All of them are living peacefully or cohabitating peacefully in the kingdom. A little child would lead them. Who's the them in the passage here? The animals. Right. That's the them in the context that he's talking about. So a little child would lead them. Under normal circumstances, a little child would never be able to control some of those animals. In fact, those animals would probably eat the young child. Okay, Dale?
I hate to be hard-headed, but when Barnabas took Paul to Jerusalem, they were afraid of Paul, then Paul, wouldn't he represent leading them? That Paul, who was formerly violent natured, and now he's in the kingdom, and now he's peaceful. Now he's a Christian.
I think you're trying to stretch the illustration. He's he's showing the peaceful nature of everything under the messianic reign of Christ. Now, is that always the case? No, because of sin that enters into it. But within the church, there is that peaceful attitude. In verse 7, he goes on, the cow and the bear shall feed, their young ones shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. Again, the bear would normally eat the cow. So here they eat together in peace, and their young ones are sleeping together. Would not happen under normal circumstances. But then notice this aspect. The lion shall eat straw like the ox. Does the lion eat straw? No. The lion is a animal. Now I can't even pronounce it. Carnivorous animal. How's the lion thus going to eat straw? It can't. It would take a complete redesign of their digestive tract in order to accomplish this. So, what do we learn from that, though? Is God going to redesign the animals? If he does, it's no longer really a lion, is it? It's something else. It would have to be another animal, different kind of animal. We learn that he's speaking figuratively. These things are not to be taken literally, but they are figures of speech to portray the peaceful aspect of the kingdom. Remember when we were doing the introduction to the prophets? Now, just a couple of weeks ago, wasn't it? I know, it was over a year ago. We said that the prophets were, in their figurative language, they were trying to express ideas and thoughts in ways in which people of that time could understand them. I don't remember all of the illustrations that I used. It seems like I use an illustration Think of the jet planes that we have and traveling by a jet plane. And go back, let's say 200 years from today, and try to explain that to people of that time. Now, how are you going to do it? You're going to tell them, well, we flew this from this place to this place by a jet plane. Huh? What do you mean flew? Well, we got in a plane. What's a plane? You see, you can't use our terminology to express those ideas to people that have no concept of them. So what do? Well, we got into this huge ship-like thing, and we got going real fast, and we started taking off and leaving the ground, and we were able to go from one place to another place, going at unbelievable speeds and we were able to arrive at this place in a matter of hours. Well, even then, you're getting concepts that they don't understand, really. That's what prophets are trying to do. And so instead of just saying, in that Messianic kingdom, there's going to be peace. Now, yes, there are times in which it's stated. But now then, he's illustrating with ideas that they will understand, thus figurative language, to express those ideas that we see in the Messianic kingdom or the church, in terminology and in ideas that they would understand. Just like, a jet plane carries, 747 carries 200-300 people. I don't even know how many. So you can't say a jet plane to them. You'd say something like a huge ship. They can understand, a huge ship and a lot of people getting on a huge ship. So that's what Isaiah is doing. But when he says that the lion shall eat straw like the ox, he's thus showing to us he's using figurative language. This isn't literal. Now, the premillennialist comes along today, and they try to literalize these things. And they basically do believe that God is going to redesign the digestive tracts to where these things are naturally taking place. And that, yes, the wolf literally will dwell with the lion or lamb, and leopard lying down with the young goat, and so forth. And that these things will take place in that future kingdom that they imagine of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. But no, it would take, as I said, a complete redesign of the digestive system of the lion, and thus it's no longer a lion, is it? Something else then. So he's using figurative language in this. He goes on in verse 8, still using these figures. The suckling child shall play on the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the cockatrice's den. While the King James uses asp, New King James, New American Standard has cobra. It's a venomous serpent. Whether it's an actual cobra or not, that might be debatable, but it's a venomous serpent or snake of some type. So the baby is going to be playing where the venomous snakes are. And, of course, nothing's going to happen to the baby. The child that's been weaned, putting his hand on the cockatrice's den. Again, others use the word adder or viper here. Again, a very poisonous being. So here's, while it says a winged or the weaned child, it's still dealing with an infant, but one that's old enough to have been weaned from its mother. I think what Eddie Whitten wrote concerning this is pretty applicable when he says, quote, "The natural characteristics of the principles and the beautiful descriptions related defy the abnormal behavior expressed. The sentence of God upon the serpent in Genesis 3:15 belies the prophecy regarding the sucking child and the whole of the asp. The asp, according to Genesis 3:15, should be the natural enemy of human beings. To present them as being peaceful toward each other does not conform to nature or natural or expected conduct, especially of the asp." He adds that some see this as the removal of that enmity. I would see that more from the standpoint that Christ destroyed the power of Satan at his resurrection, or at his death, actually. That's Hebrews 2, and I think it's around verse 9 or thereabouts. That Christ destroyed the power of Satan through his death. But still, you have that peaceful conduct of these natural antagonistic animals, and here in specific with the asp and with the cockatrice's den, both poisonous beings, and a young child playing there. In verse 9 then, he goes on to state, "They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea."
That verse you refer to in Hebrews 2, "For as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is, the devil."
Okay. That's verse 9, isn't it? 14. Okay. Hebrews 2:14. In verse 9, then, this is the condition of God's holy mountain. Now, what is God's holy mountain? What's the church? We studied this more extensively when we covered Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 2. There it's, "And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow into it." And of course, when we see the mountain of the Lord's house, we're told in 1 Timothy 3, is the church. That it's going to be established in the top of the mountains. And we see that it's going to be established at Jerusalem. It's going to be exalted. The church is that exalted house of God. It has been exalted, and that all nations flowing into it, being the universal nature of the kingdom. We also see it in Daniel 2. And in verse 35 and verse 44, When Daniel is in verse 35, setting forth the actual dream of Nebuchadnezzar, that the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and gold broken to pieces together and became like chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone, the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And then when we get to verse 44, that in the days of those kings, this is the explanation of that dream. In the days of those kings, having reference to the kings of the Roman Empire, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. Well, that kingdom is the church, of course, and many passages show such, which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So that stone which strikes the image is going to destroy those world empires. It's going to become a world empire, in the fact that all nations shall flow into it, that it becomes literally the mountain of the Lord's house, the church. So this is Isaiah describing the conditions of the church. And in doing so, what he is showing us is the power of the gospel to change the heart of men. Now then, Dale, what you were saying in relationship to Saul of Tarsus, who becomes Paul, would be applicable in that regard, that here someone has his heart changed from being antagonistic to the church and persecuting the church to one who is now this nature.
You explain it a lot better than I did.
Okay, but it is the power of the gospel that changes the heart. When Paul writes in Romans 1:16 that the power of the gospel is God's power to save. When we're dealing with that salvation, we're dealing with it, yes, from the standpoint of saving us from past sins, saving us eternally in heaven, but it also has the power to save us in the sense of changing our hearts, changing our wills. Now, God does it through the gospel. And when Paul had that gospel preached unto him, he saw the resurrected Christ, it changed his heart. So now then he becomes in that peaceful aspect of the church. And that's the power of the gospel in regards to people today. An illustration in Galatians 5th chapter. You have, starting in verse 19, the works of the flesh. Then in verse 22, you have the fruit of the Spirit. What makes a person change from living in the works of the flesh to the fruit of the Spirit? Well, he explains in that chapter, those who are led by the Spirit. What is being led by the Spirit? Not by some feeling or emotion. It is through the gospel, that which the Spirit has revealed to us. And thus, through the gospel, it shows us not to live this way. Remember Titus 2, verse 11 and following. Here's the grace of God that brings salvation. What does it do? It teaches us. What does it teach us? It teaches us first to deny ungodliness and worldly lust. Well, in that, the works of the flesh, same thing. And then to live soberly, righteously, and godly. Isn't that the fruit of the Spirit? And adding the fruit of the Spirit to our life? So it's the grace of God teaching us to do that. Or it's the gospel of Jesus Christ that teaches us to do that. But we're the ones who have to make the change. It's not a direct operation upon our hearts. It's us reading what God says, and because of our desire to please God and to be obedient to Him and to receive the blessings that He's going to give to His children, we stop living this way and we start living this way. Now that's what Isaiah is talking about here. That here's that power to change a person's heart from this to where we have that peaceful aspect of the kingdom. Carl?
2 Corinthians 5:17. Wherefore, if any man is in Christ, he is a new creature, and the old things are passed away. Behold, they are become new.
Okay, all things become new. In what sense? Well, they're new in the sense that he's living a new life. What is that life? Well, Romans 6 and verse 4, we're raised out of that water grave of baptism to walk in what? Newness of life. So in that act of baptism, we change our state from that old man to become that new man. We change our state from being lost to being saved. Dale?
For he is our peace, who has made both one, broken down the middle off petition, and he says to make himself a twain one new man, making peace.
Okay, that's in Ephesians 2 and verse 14 and 15, I think. And that, the context of that, if you look at it, is the animosity between Jew and Gentile. That there was a natural animosity, and that which brought upon that animosity was the law of Moses, in which the law of Moses separated the Jewish people from the rest of the world, the Gentile world. And he says Christ broke down that middle wall of partition, that which was separating them, so that both Jew and Gentile can be at peace. There's a oneness that's there, and thus the peaceful aspect of the church. But we also see even men who would be aggressive and those who would be non-aggressive, their character, their nature. Now, we probably know people who reside in both of those camps, don't we? People that would be very aggressive, that would be, dare I say, a type A personality, as we hear it put today, with those who, and we also know people who are non-aggressive in nature. Very laid back, nothing's going to bother them, nothing. Well, both of those characters, those two type of personalities don't harmonize a great deal. The aggressive person becomes frustrated at the non-aggressive person, and likewise the non-aggressive person kind of, what's the big problem that you're having? What's wrong with you? Now then, he's showing these two types of characteristics of man, they can live in harmony. The peace that Isaiah is talking about is a spiritual peace, not a physical peace. And that again goes back to what we were mentioning, the figurative language. He's not talking about physical peace, the same type of peace that the world talks about. But this is a spiritual peace. Remember what Jesus says in John 14 and in verse 27 when he tells, and this is being spoken to his apostles specifically, peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth give I unto you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. That's peace. And the peaceful aspect specifically that Jesus is talking about in relationship to an inner being. You can be at peace. You don't have to allow your heart to be troubled or afraid. Then we would also remember what Paul wrote in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 7 about the peace of God that passeth all understanding shall keep your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. There's a peaceful aspect of the church or the kingdom. And it is a spiritual peace, not physical. That's why Paul could state there in Philippians 4:7, which passeth all understanding. He's dealing with the understanding from a physical standpoint. A person in the world doesn't understand that type of peace. A type of peace that even though being threatened, being persecuted, they can endure those things with joy when they're being persecuted for righteousness' sake. Get the person in the world to understand that type of peace. They're not going to. Why? Because it's not an earthly peace, it's a spiritual peace. Or not a physical peace, it's spiritual in nature.
In John 3 and 5, and when he talks about except a man being born again, he's not born, he says he's born of the flesh, but he's born of the spirit.
Okay, there's a distinction between a fleshly birth as opposed to a spiritual birth. Then for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. The knowledge of Yahweh or Jehovah would go throughout the world. In Habakkuk 2 and verse 14, he makes a statement similar to this, that for the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So you have the basic same idea being presented. It's going to go throughout the world. Now then, in the Great Commission, what did Jesus tell his apostles? Go into all the world. Preach the gospel. We see that, well, let's just give an approximate date of 33 AD. By the time Paul writes Romans, around 58 AD, Romans 10th chapter, everyone in the world had heard the gospel. He repeats it again in writing to the Colossians around 63, that every creature under heaven had heard the word of God. So there's the knowledge of the Lord going all through the world. They obeyed that commission to preach the gospel to every creature. Now then, it's that knowledge of the Lord was by the majority of people rejected. Jesus tells us that's going to take place in Matthew the 7th chapter. When that knowledge is rejected by a generation or a couple of generations, what happens to it? If what? Not only diminishes, but it eventually disappears. So what happens, we talk about those, and it's always deep, dark Africa, who have never heard the word of the gospel. There's a few things that can be stated about that. They have an obligation to find God, to search after him because of nature. That's Acts the 17th chapter, Paul's sermon to the Athenians. But it is also it's the consequence of their ancestors. You take a person today who is raised in a home that is totally antagonistic toward God, toward the gospel. What's going to happen? I'll say 99% of those cases were of their children. Same thing's going to take place. What if you have an entire country doing that, rejecting the gospel? What happens? It's gone.
But we can see where the knowledge of Christ was in Hebrews 8:11, and they shall not teach every man his fellow citizen, and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest of them all.
Well, that's dealing with those in the covenant. And that's dealing with the contrast, because it's a quote from Jeremiah 31 through 34, where Jeremiah is making a contrast. Here's the Jews. They became a part of that covenant. Then they had to learn God. They became a part of that covenant through physical birth. You don't become a member of the church or the new covenant in that way. You have to be taught the gospel before you become a member of the covenant. And so they will not be taught to know the Lord. Why? Because they already know him. The old covenant wasn't that way. They were part of the covenant. Then they had to be taught about God. So that's the aspect of Hebrews 8. This is the aspect of it just going throughout the world. It went throughout the world, even though the majority of people rejected it, even as Jesus stated, in regards to all peoples of all times, that the majority of people are going to be lost. Matthew 7:13 and 14. Eddie Whitten again made some observations regarding this prophecy that I thought were very good. He has 8 different observations. And he says, 1, using the character of the inhabitants of the wild, Isaiah describes the overwhelming viciousness, greed, selfishness, inhumanity, and ruthlessness of the power of Satan. Satan works through the instrumentality of man. Therefore, satanic power was exercised by evil men all through the Old Testament period. 2, the record of God's people during the Old Testament time reflects an eye for an eye principle. Violence attended the Jews constantly. He adds it still does. 3, the domestic qualities of the lamb, the kid, the calf, the little child represent the peaceful nature of God. 4, there is natural enmity between the forces of evil and the nature of God. 5, under normal circumstances, it would not be possible for the peaceful, domestic, docile attributes of God to survive against the wild, violent power of Satan. 6, there must be an amalgamating influence to negate the imbalance of power. 7, the resolution of the problem will be in God's holy mountain. And 8, the solution rests in the knowledge of the Lord. I thought those observations were really interesting and very apropos, every one of them. And I think the summation The solution rests in the knowledge of the Lord. That will be the solution, and that is the solution in relationship to the problems of humanity and the problems that Satan brings. And if it were not for God and His providential means today, the church and all of the things dealing with the church would be destroyed. The church would not be able to survive. I think one of the marks of inspiration of the Bible is what is referred to as the victory over all attacks. The Bible has been attacked throughout the centuries, from the very beginning in which it was at the time in which it was given. People tried to destroy it. During the Dark Ages, it was attempted to be destroyed by its friends. It's attempted to be destroyed today by its friends. Now I'm using friends in a loose way, a quote-unquote friends, as they attack, for example, the authorship. If you go to biblical criticism, you have what is referred to as higher critics and lower critics, attacking even what the Bible says. You had a few years ago, even though it's pretty much defunct now, the Jesus Seminar, in which they selected what was part of the Bible, or what Jesus actually said and what He didn't. And what they determined was accurate in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John was about 1%, or about 1% of the actual statements that are found therein. Practically nothing was actually true. Yet, friends of the Bible, it's been attacked by enemies. Nations, you have the skeptics. Voltaire proclaimed his writings would destroy the Bible. Wouldn't be one left upon the earth except in a museum. And things like unto that. The Bible has always been able to be victorious over all attacks. How? Well, the providence of God. God's providence has made sure that, as Jesus says, my word shall not pass away. Matthew 24 and verse 36.
Wasn't Voltaire's printing press, and he made that prediction, eventually used to print Bibles?
That has been what has been claimed, that it was used by the American Bible Society to print Bibles. We will start then next week with verse 10.